Hello, my name is Melissa Weitengruber, and I'm going to be talking about a process called glycolysis. So, the prefix glycose stands for glucose, and the suffix lysis means breakdown. So, the name glycolysis literally means the breakdown of glucose. Not all organisms go through this process, but the ones that do, it takes place inside the cytosol of their cell. So ultimately, cells, they get their energy from oxidizing nutrients such as glucose into phosphate. Glucose is easy for them to digest, so it's one of the most common pathways. The energy that is released from this is used to form ATP. Now, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of the cells. Glycolysis is a catabolic pathway that involves multiple enzymatic reactions that break down sugars, and it is also the beginning of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration has three parts to it, and that is glycolysis. And from glycolysis, if oxygen is used, it moves into the Krebs cycle, which is also known as the citric acid cycle. From the citric acid cycle, it then moves into the ETC, which is the electron transport chain. So it can be done in two ways, either with oxygen or without oxygen. With oxygen is called aerobic, without oxygen is called anaerobic. Anaerobic glycolysis is also called fermentation, and during this process it produces lactic acid. It does require oxygen if you want to convert your NADHs into ATP. If there is oxygen, you eventually go from the cytosol into the mitochondria, where the Krebs cycle will take place, and then onto the electron transport chain. So, glycolysis starts out with glucose. This is a glucose molecule. Glucose is made out of 6 carbons. The first step of glycolysis is adding 2 phosphates to this glucose molecule, which results in a 6-carbon sugar diphosphate. So here you can see your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons and your 2 phosphates on each end. So this results when glucose gets phosphorylated by an enzyme that is called hexokinase. Now, anytime you hear the word kinase, you should know that it works on phosphate groups by utilizing ATP to either add or move a phosphate group. So, ATP donates a phosphate group, and then it becomes adenosine diphosphate instead of adenosine triphosphate. The di stands for 2, tri stands for 3. In doing this, it's also donating energy. This adds a phosphate group at the 6th carbon of glucose, and this is called glucose 6-phosphate. A little rearranging is done of the carbons, which makes it become fructose 6-phosphate instead of glucose 6-phosphate. And there's no energy required to do this. Enzymes lower the activation energy, and 1 ATP is used for this phosphorylation. So glucose is split up, and then you end up with one 3-carbon sugar phosphate molecule, which is also referred to as glyceraldehyde 3-phosphates, and you have one dihydroxyacetone phosphate. So this reaction is irreversible once it's done. 1 ATP is made per glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and so therefore you have 4 ATPs that is grossed in glycolysis, but you need 2 ATPs to go back and start this process again. So 4 used, or 4 made, 2 of them are used, so in the end you get to keep 2 of them. So you gross 4 ATP, you net 2 of them. ATP is required for this process to even begin, so it's often called the investment stage because glycolysis, it takes energy to make energy. So each of these 2 3-carbon molecules then goes through a series of steps to convert them into pyruvates. To do this, electrons are transferred and to the 2 NAD pluses, which stands for nicotine amide adenine dinucleotide. So other products that are formed are 4 ADPs and 2 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate groups. It produces ATP, but you also need to use 2 ATPs. So like I said, you reset the cycle and you gross 2, or you net 2. Your ADP is turned into ATP, and your NADs are reduced. Doing this, they gain an extra electron and a hydrogen, so they become NADHs. This reaction is caused by an enzyme called dehydrogenase. It can be oxidized later in the electron transport chain, so after you perform glycolysis, you end up with 2 pyruvates, which will ultimately be the raw materials for the Krebs cycle / citric acid cycle, whichever you want to refer to it as. You have 2 NADHs and 2 ATPs. And the reason glycolysis is so important because it produces ATP, which is ultimately used to drive many other biological or biochemical pathways in the human body.